Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 7th of October, where we are moving past Edgar Allan Poe and moving to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which would probably be the last option for you for paper number 1. So in terms of paper number 1, I wanted to talk a little bit about quoting, though I'm hopeful that this is something that you have done in previous English classes. And I also wanted to lay the foundation for Jekyll and Hyde and prepare you for Dracula, because Dracula is the longest read of this semester, and the sooner you can start with Dracula, the better off you are. And I have been able to find the link for Dracula that's listed in the 10th section of our notes below so that you can begin reading. As you know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a novella, so it is longer than a short story, but it is not as long as a novel. It's someplace in between there. Frankenstein was our novel, and Edgar Allan Poe was an example of short story. We read only 4 of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, but I think you can see with just the 4 that we've read and some of the quotations that you highlighted in the discussion forum that he definitely has themes that we see throughout his writing. And in terms of thinking about quotation, the MLA, the Modern Language Association, which is the system that we're using, talks a little bit about how to go about quoting. I have that in the second section, the notes below. Again, I'm hopeful that this is review for you, but also we had reviewed some websites that I'm fond of. The first being GCC's own library website. They're well aware that you are going to be writing a paper, so I've included a link where you can find information on how to write papers. And also the Purdue OWL website, which is from Purdue University, and they've made it accessible to the public, which is nice. You don't have to be a student from Purdue. And they will also review quotation as well as the entire writing process as well. And basically, you want to make sure that you're using the correct system for the correct discipline. So the MLA, Modern Language Association, is what we use for the humanities, and that also includes languages. And basically what you do is you use parenthetical documentation. So first you use your quotation marks. Of course, anything inside of the quotation marks are supposed to indicate that you are quoting exactly word for word. And after the quotation marks, what you are doing is using parentheses to indicate the least amount of information in those parentheses to show where you're getting your quotation from. Usually that means a page number. It depends on what source you're using. And if it turns out that you are using multiple outside sources and it's unclear where you're getting your quotation from, you might need to add the author's surname in addition to something like the page number. And if you're using multiple sources by the same author, you might need to use part of the title of the text and the author's surname and a page number. And the way that all of this works is that at the ending, you've got a works cited page where you're listing all of your sources in alphabetical order by author's last name. And then the MLA works almost like what I call a cookbook, in that you just sort of look up your particular instance, because there are particular rules or recipes that you have to follow for citing something like a book as opposed to a magazine article, as opposed to a website, as opposed to a short story, so forth and so on. And basically you just follow that, and you indicate, or it'll indicate where you're supposed to put your punctuation. It'll indicate what kinds of information you're supposed to add. So you just follow that. So I'm giving you some examples below that if you are going to, let's say, continue a sentence after you have documented a quote, you just continue your sentence and then you end your sentence. So the example is, quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, and then in the parentheses 162, that would be the page number, he cannot pray with his mother. So That said, um, in theory, you would have that works cited page that would list all your sources. But if you're going to be writing a critical paper, which is what I've asked you to do, which is to just write on the primary source and not use any outside sources. And in theory, if you've already learned how to write a works cited page in previous English classes, I'm not going to require that you submit in a works cited page. That said, if you do write a works cited page, you want to make sure that you're doing it correctly, that you're following the rules. And certainly, if you are using additional resources, you have to use a works cited page. But the parenthetical documentation would be enough for me. And if you're going to insert something into a quote, your own language, usually to clarify something, pronouns oftentimes, what you do is you add square brackets. And within those square brackets, that's ultimately your original information or your original language. That's not part of the quote itself. And if you're going to omit something from a quote, well, then what you use is what we call an ellipsis, fondly known as ... or period. And you don't use that at the beginning or the ending of the quote. You use that in the middle of a quote. Basically, you get to decide where to start and end your quote. But in between that starting and stopping point, if you were to leave out something, you would, because you wanted basically a shorter quote, not because you wanted to change its meaning, but it was just something that wasn't relevant, then you would use that ellipsis of the 3 periods. So if somebody were to verify the authenticity of your quote, if you were using square brackets within your quote, that wouldn't be part of the original quote. Anything in the square brackets would be your addition. Again, not your commentary, but probably just to clarify something in the quote. And if you were going to omit something from a quote, again, not to change its meaning, but probably because it just wasn't relevant, then you would use the ellipsis or those 3 periods. Again, I recommend Purdue OWL and the GCC library. You can see those links below in terms of quotation. So that said, as you are thinking about either Frankenstein or you're thinking about Edgar Allan Poe, and if you're thinking about Poe, I would limit it to probably 2 stories maximum, because you want to be able to do a decent job in approximately 4 to 5 pages. That's just an approximation. You can write as much or as little as you'd like, but I think that gives you an idea how much effort to put into the paper and how much time to put into the paper. But if you're thinking that you don't want to write about Frankenstein and you don't want to write about Edgar Allan Poe, you might perhaps want to write about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And just to prepare you for that text, and hopefully we're at the point in the semester now that you have finished reading Poe, and either you're finished reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or you are close to it. Knowing something about the 1800 society is particularly important for Jekyll and Hyde and also for our upcoming Dracula. And on its very bare surface, the 1800s Victorian society, especially the 1880s, was known for being very repressive, and I think that very much is indicative in texts like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and also Dracula. It was also very important, or it was also very repressive in terms of sexuality, and that's also going to be very important for us to understand texts such as Jekyll and Hyde and Dracula as well. There's a lot of psychological elements, and we've talked about this with Poe. We'll also talk about it with Stevenson as well in these upcoming texts. You know, if you think about Freudian analysis, well, there's the id, there's the ego, and there's the superego. If you know anything about those 3 aspects of personality, the id is our base desires, and our superego is our conscience. And then our ego is supposed to try to balance those 2, our base instincts with our conscience. And I can tell you that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sort of plays with those ideas, with the transformation that occurs from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde, and that the impetus of that is part of the repressive nature of the time period that did not acknowledge or allow for anything that deviated from societal norms. You may or may not have heard of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I know that certainly Frankenstein has become part of our popular culture, and Edgar Allan Poe is usually an author that's read in the K through 12 level. But if you've ever heard the term Jekyll and Hyde, it does come from this novel. Um, Stevenson was a Scottish novelist. He wrote Treasure Island. You might be familiar with that. And the novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is the title in its entirety, though it's usually shortened to Jekyll and Hyde, gives us an idea about how we are going to get a mystery story. We are also going to be getting narrative embedded within narrative, which is something that we talked about with Frankenstein as well. And some of the themes you can expect, obviously repression, but also the tensions of socioeconomic class, the rich and the poor, and how those two are radically different from one another. Drug use and abuse, which is something that we talked about with Edgar Allan Poe as well. And the idea of reverse evolution, Darwinism, if you will. The idea is that we're supposed to evolve, but we could also go backwards as well to our animalistic nature. The Psyche, which I had suggested with Edgar Allan Poe. And of course, as we've seen, doubling and doppelganger is going to be an issue as well. There have been a good number of movie adaptations. I don't know if there's ever been a movie adaptation that is as famous as the 1930s Universal version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that's or the movie version, I should say, of Frankenstein. I don't know if there's any version of Jekyll and Hyde that is as famous as the 1930s version of Frankenstein that's led to its iconic inclusion in our society. But expect that just about any movie adaptation you are going to see, and I'm going to offer a movie adaptation as well in the future in this class, is going to take a good number of textual liberties. And almost always it provides a heterosexual love interest. And this is one of the interesting things that we're going to talk about, is why is there a need to provide a heterosexual love interest in these films when we don't necessarily get that in the actual text itself. I don't want to give away too many spoilers, just in the event that you're still reading it. But I know how I was first introduced to Jekyll and Hyde. And it was through, of all things, a TV cartoon. This does date me. Bugs Bunny. And if nothing else, again, the term Jekyll and Hyde is probably part of popular culture, even though the story may not necessarily be. And I was able to find that clip. It's 10 minutes long, so for your amusement and entertainment, under the 7th section in the notes below, I am going to ask you to watch that clip. It'll make a lot more sense, that clip, after you've read the text itself. Bugs Bunny cartoons, and actually Warner Brothers cartoons, were really quite brilliant in many respects, and oftentimes made references to literature and music and lots of other academic areas. I also included a link for your entertainment and amusement of a club in New York City that is devoted to the myth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's called the Jekyll and Hyde Club, and I have been there. It is a theme restaurant. The food is mediocre, but that's not why you attend this particular restaurant. You attend it for the atmosphere. So I haven't been there in several years, but I know that when I was last there, the serving people all dressed as horror figures. There were big screens on the wall that were showing iconic horror films, such as the 1930s Frankenstein. There was a whole narrative that was embedded in that particular restaurant experience. That there was a Mr. Hyde that had escaped and could be making an appearance at any point. Wonderful things like having portraits on the wall with moving eyes, or stools at the bar that would ever so slightly move up or down, so when somebody left the bar they were disoriented. So it's a real fun place. Again, the food, but that's not why you go there. But of all the things that I wanted you to watch or view, I have a video for you that I think will be quite helpful, talking about the bizarre truth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's 13 minutes long, so I'm going to end today's video a little bit sooner than normal so that you have the opportunity to look at those links. And that will begin to explain some of the reasons why Jekyll and Hyde has become iconic, at least on some level, in terms of the Gothic tradition. Now, you might be familiar with the Jack the Ripper murders, which occurred actually 2 years after the novel. But to give you an idea of the merger between the two, there was actually a stage production that was done of Jekyll and Hyde around the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, where there was a serial killer, in effect, in London killing prostitutes, and it was thought that the serial killer was a surgeon just because of the way the murders were committed with a lot of surgical precision. The killer was never found. But to go back to that dramatic performance of Jekyll and Hyde, there were audience members who were actually identifying the actor playing Mr. Hyde as being Jack the Ripper, which was not the case. But you will definitely see parallels between the two, the Jack the Ripper case and Jekyll and Hyde. I suppose it's a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Don't know if Jekyll and Hyde helped to inspire in any way so the Ripper murders, or it's just an unhappy coincidence. One of the things you will find in Jekyll and Hyde, that a lot of evil sins are committed, but we aren't given specific details about most of those. And the speculation is part of the interest of the novel itself. Of course, with Jack the Ripper, the media gave very specific elements about the evils that were being committed. Again, prostitutes who were having body organs removed by surgical manner. The fact that this was an incredibly repressive society in terms of sexuality is probably one of the reasons for the Jack the Ripper murders. Certainly is one of the reasons for the text Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the fact that there was a thriving prostitution trade in a time period that was so repressive that sexuality was reserved for only marriage and only for procreation, I think is quite telling. And the fact that venereal disease and other sexually transmitted diseases was running rampant during this time, I think is also quite telling. So the fact that there was this underbelly of activity going on right underneath the prim and proper Victorian society is something that you can expect to see in Jekyll and Hyde. So today's attendance question, which is more out of curiosity than anything else as we're transitioning, this will be due Wednesday on the 9th, though of course if you need additional time, let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to. But you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And that'll be particularly helpful, I think, when you are reading the quotations of Edgar Allan Poe. But for this particular question, to transition us into Jekyll and Hyde, is, did you know anything about Jekyll and Hyde prior to this course? And if so, what did you know? So that'll help lay the foundation as to how well it's known from a popular culture perspective. Again, Edgar Allan Poe and Frankenstein, I think, being firmly cemented in the idea of popular culture, and definitely Dracula, which was what we're headed towards. And in the 10th section, again, I've included a link to Dracula in the event that you don't have a specific hard copy of the work. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about, well, Jekyll and Hyde. Take care. Bye-bye.